COP28. And each year, the webinar series brought together on average over 3,000 participants from across the world, and the YouTube recordings with around 8,000 views have also been widely used, also as teaching materials in classrooms. So building on the success of these two previous webinar series, and as part of the contribution to the Pillar 3 of the Greening Education Partnership, a third series of 6 conversations will start from today, from May to December. And this year, we are focused on the topic of greening teacher training and education systems capacities. So on the road to COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan, each episode will delve into the challenges at all levels of education, starting from early childhood, primary, secondary, and tertiary, from the diverse perspectives of teachers, educators, young people, and policymakers, as well as to explore concrete solutions to greening teacher training and education systems capacities in order to deliver quality climate change education. So before diving into the discussion of this first webinar, I would like to first invite Mr. Daniel Villotti, Senior Director of Program Coordination of the UNFCCC, to give welcome remarks to kick off the third season on behalf of the organizers, UNESCO and UNFCCC.
UN Climate Change is pleased to join UNESCO in launching the third series of webinars on climate change education for social transformation. I thank Stefania Giannini, Assistant Director General for Education, UNESCO, for the continued impactful collaboration between our agencies and the efforts dedicated to the operationalization of the Greening Education Partnership, of which UN Climate Change is a proud member. The Greening Education Partnership continues to successfully catalyze commitment from member states and non-state actors to mainstream climate education in schools, in communities, in teacher training, and in lifelong learning. While it is important to acknowledge progress, we have much more work to do to ensure the education system will propel us toward the transition to a just, low-emission, climate-resilient world. The Climate Change Education for Social Transformation webinar series has proven to be an effective and accessible way to deliver on the work of the Greening Education Partnership by raising awareness and enable learning among educators as well as the broader public. In its 6th assessment report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change highlighted the importance of the relationship between behavioral science and climate action across societies. From the evidence, it is clear that investing in education, public awareness and training on the systems, attitudes, and behaviors that will enable everyone to be full-fledged climate change actors and decision makers is one of the lowest risk, high-impact strategies that governments, the private sector, and civil society can deploy. The architects of the Convention and Paris Agreement understood the power of this strategy, which is known under UNFCCC process as Action for Climate Empowerment, and it has 6 elements: climate change education and public awareness, training, public participation and access to information, and international cooperation as an important means of delivering on these things. At COP28, parties to the Paris Agreement reiterated the important role of Action for Climate Empowerment in the outcome of the global stocktake by encouraging parties to broaden climate education and to empower people, in particular children and youth, with the knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes necessary for active action to address climate change and enable effective adaptation action. Teachers and educators are essential components of this low-risk, high-impact strategy to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, and we must support them in their vital role. Support them with the knowledge, resources, and tools they need to reskill themselves and, in turn, to equip and skill current and future generations. And so, the focus of the third webinar series, Greening Teacher Training and Education Systems Capacities, will explore how to strengthen policy planning, financing, and the capacity of teachers, educators, and policymakers to integrate climate change and sustainability into teaching. We know that rapidly scaling the transformation of the education sector can only be achieved through collective effort. We therefore hope that you find this series useful, that you will gain deep and resources available, and that you will share the webinar series with your colleagues and communities to reach as many teachers and educators as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daniele Villotti, for your welcome remarks. So today's conversation, titled "How Can Teachers Be Supported to Educate Children on Climate Change?" kicks off the series of conversations on the challenges and practical solutions to climate change education by delving into the conversation on getting teachers and educators in early childhood primary education ready to teach about climate change. And in addition, the session will discuss ways of enhancing the education system's capacities to enable effective delivery of quality climate change education. So today's discussion will be guided by these two key questions. First, what are the needs and gaps on climate change education in early childhood and primary education? And second, how could these needs and gaps be filled? So the discussion will start with interviews with the panelists, followed by a moderated question and answer. So before we begin, I would like to introduce you to a tool that we will be using during the session to engage everyone joining via Zoom and YouTube today. So you can go to slido.com, and enter the event code #0305 as shown on the screen. You can also scan the QR code on the screen with your phone and follow the link to the browser. This tool will serve two purposes. First, to allow you to raise questions throughout the session, which will be addressed during the Q&A to the extent possible. And then second, to engage you directly for inputs later in the webinar. So now I have the pleasure of introducing today's three panelists who will share their views on and experiences. First, Ms. Alana Rosario Dominguez Avila, General Director of Curriculum and Evaluation and Undersecretary of Technical and Pedagogical Affairs of the Ministry of Education, Honduras. Ms. Alana is currently joining in. And she is an experienced professional in the educational field at the basic and secondary education levels and is currently the General Director in charge of Curriculum and Evaluation. Now, the second speaker will be the Mr. Brett Weisel. Brett Weisel is the Global Policy and Advocacy Lead for the Early Childhood Development Action Network, ECDAN, where he is responsible for leading ECDAN's advocacy strategy. So welcome on board, Brett. And finally, the third speaker is from Lebanon, Mr. Ahmed El Baghdadi, primary school teacher joining us. And Ahmed is an educator and avid climate advocate who created a climate education program called Planet B that focuses on teacher training, resource creation, and project implementation, and is currently teaching at Sagayan Levin School in Lebanon. So thank you very much, all three panelists, for joining us today and also sharing your valuable experiences with us. So let us start with the first question on what you think are the needs and gaps in early childhood and primary education when it comes to the needs of the teachers and educators in supporting and making sure that quality climate education is delivered. So to reflect on this question together, I would like to invite everybody to join to please go to slido.com and enter the event code #0305 and share your views on the question. You can also scan, of course, the QR code and open it in your mobile phone or on your browser. Now, with the first question, what are the needs and gaps that teachers have and educators have? I hope that we can show the results on the screen as we go. So please join in the slido.com. And while you're joining in, please allow me to introduce our moderator of today, who was experiencing earlier a little bit of technical issues of joining. So Ingrid, you're with us today, right? So please allow me to introduce our moderator for the session, Ms. Ingrid Sanchez Tapia, the co-coordinator of Working Group 3 on greening teacher training and education systems capacities of the Greening Education Partnership, and of course, the global lead on climate change and education senior advisor at UNICEF. So thank you, Ingrid, for joining, and I'm glad that you're able to join us today. So over to you now on the first question and the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juan. Indeed, there were some technical difficulties this morning, but we are here now together. So colleagues, you have received all the instructions for engaging through Slido. And welcome. So we are going to reflect first on the questions on Slido together. So we are seeing how it keeps on changing on the screen. Okay, so now we're seeing the results. Let's give it a moment so that we see how our word cloud shapes up. Well, as we are seeing here, it seems like the curriculum and lack of resources available comes as a very strong consideration. Now we see emerging also the importance of training teachers and resources. So perhaps with this, as this shapes up and continues populating, we can go to our panelists to reflect on this word cloud, and from their experience address the first question. So let's go with Ahmad. Ahmad, given your experience as a primary school teacher, and you are also very active in promoting climate change education, could you please share your views of the needs and gaps, particularly in primary education, in regards to quality climate change education? Over to you, Ahmad.
Thank you, Ingrid. Well, I need to say that there's a lot of gaps and needs when it comes to all sorts of education when it comes to climate awareness or climate readiness. I can share a few of them. In my own case, in Lebanon, we can see that there's outdated curriculums that has barely any mention on climate change or any environmental aspect in the curriculum. Another point that I need to be talking about is teachers' readiness. I've seen many times throughout my engagement with different teachers that they are not to be teaching about climate change topics in their schools because they are not aware, or they're not properly educated on the topic itself. Moreover, they have no time or no clear incentives for them to be teaching about climate education in their classrooms. They are focused on finishing the already packed curriculums of subjects in their classrooms, and they don't see any time for them to be teaching about climate education in the classroom. So this is one aspect that I saw during my work as an educator myself and with my colleagues within the Planet B program. Moreover, I can also highlight one point, which is the lack of resources available for teachers to be using So we can find a lot of resources, for example, in multiple languages, which is probably English or maybe in French, but like there's no diversity in the resources available for different contexts. And what we realized also in our work is that if we found the resources, they are only focusing on the US and EU's perspective, and they are not focusing on a global perspective or a contextualized perspective for each country to be moving forward to teach their students on their lived reality in their own countries, which is also a tricky part for us. And at the end, which is, I think that we all believe that there's a lack of proper funding for greening schools and curriculum in our context. So all those combined provide a huge gap for primary and childhood education when it comes to climate education itself.
Thank you so much, Ahmad. And I think you have highlighted here very critical points. And as we are teaching about climate education in the primary grades and the lower grades, the need for contextualization, quality materials in the mother tongue, it's critical. And there's indeed, as you point out, a huge gap in resources, in funding for covering this. So with this, I'd like to go to our next panelist, Mr. Brett Wiesel. Brett, could you share the needs and gaps on greening teacher development and teacher training aspects from the perspective of the early childhood community? Thank you.
Yes.
Over to you.
Thank you, Ingrid. I'm glad you're asking people in the country what is needed, because that's really what matters. We need to hear from those working in the field about what is most important in their countries and their context. But I see a lot of common themes emerge, and what Ahmed is saying is really resonating. But in terms of the early years, I think first let's just acknowledge that the gaps that we face supporting the early childhood workforce on climate change are the same in terms of supporting the early childhood workforce in general. In other words, we're talking about training, decent wages, professionalization, ensuring quality, curriculum, financing budgets, interagency coordination. Like these are the needs of the early childhood care and education, regardless of the issue. So let's recognize that as a starting point, because I think what's good for early child development is good for early child development and climate change. So I think that's a good starting point. But we all realize there are some very particular gaps that we must address when it comes to climate change and early childhood. One of ECDAN's partners, the Global Schools Forum, I encourage you to check out their website. They recently conducted a survey, actually, with teachers and ECD practitioners about climate change. And they're still crunching the numbers and going through the data, but they did share some of their initial takeaways with me. And here's what sort of emerged from that analysis. There's a lack of training and standards to support early childhood practitioners and teachers to deliver climate curricula. I think that's not surprising. Lack of mental health support for teachers to grapple with climate change. That emerged. Lack of awareness of teachers themselves about the implications of climate change. There are contextual differences, which Ahmed highlighted, that make ensuring the curricula is culturally and contextually appropriate across countries and regions. Again, this is not necessarily unique to climate change. There are concerns about the impact severe weather and heat will have on limiting outdoor time and play. And this, I think, is critical. In general, from an infrastructure perspective, it does not seem like the sector is very well prepared for a change in climate. And that's really alarming, because we know young children are particularly susceptible, right, to the impacts of climate change, such as extreme heat, for example, due to the development stage. And so, this is really concerning, because if it limits outdoor time, if it limits outdoor play time, it's going to impact the ability to deliver nurturing care. So none of these early findings are particularly surprising. And I think it sort of reinforces what we all assume. We're also seeing some really exciting work happening. Organizations like Earth Warriors and BRAC are developing and integrating curricula into their programming. But in general, it does seem like models and examples and the evidence of what works best are fairly limited. So again, none of this is terribly surprising. But let me just take a quick step back from the specifics and just recognize one other additional gap, and that's in addition to these specific needs, I think there are sort of two overarching gaps that we need to address. One is ensuring that we have an inclusive definition of terms like education and schools, and system strengthening. Because we need to ensure that we are inclusive of pre-primary and childcare settings in those conversations and agendas. So let's look at the greening education agenda as an example. I think we need to ensure that the early childhood workforce are part of that process, are part of the curricular development, are part of the education system strengthening. And because we know that that's often overlooked. We know learning does not start at the primary age, right? And so we need to make sure that as we develop these agendas and systems, we're ensuring that the early years are integrated into them. The other overarching challenge, of course, is financing, but let me come back to that.
Thank you so much, Brett. And you have pointed out to a very critical point, and is that when we are considering climate and education, is not only about what the students, what the young children are learning in school, but also how climate is affecting their access to education and learning opportunities in safe learning centers and safe schools. So thank you for pointing that out. And with that, now I turn to Ms. Alana Rosario. If you could share with us your experience as curriculum director in the Ministry of Education of Honduras, what do you see as needs and gaps on teacher development and teacher training aspects on climate change education, particularly in early childhood and primary education? Over to you, Ms. Alana.
Bien, en el caso de Honduras no es diferente a la experiencia que han mencionado los compañeros que me
In the
antecedieron.
case of Honduras, matters are very similar to what we've already heard. The lack of educational resources, the deficit that exists on the curricula that is established in the pedagogical practice of the teachers. All of this is fundamental, and we can see that there is a gap in empowerment. I mean, teachers have a lot of goodwill and they launch initiatives, but you also need capacity building and support, especially in integrating climate change in educational curricula, how to improve methods, teaching and learning techniques. And there is also a lack of awareness, and this is particularly the case among decision makers. As others have said previously, we do also need specific funding that will strengthen this component of professional development. We also have a fragmented approach. Climate change education has not been approached as a whole. We need a cross-cutting approach in all curricular areas to look more specifically into these issues. For now, it is quite limited. It is only taught, for instance, in natural sciences, and this is one of our major gaps. We need to have that additional approach, strengthening professional development, educational resources, increase awareness, and have a holistic approach. We have made steps, and we need to make good use of those good practices that exist in green schools with a curricula that establish a clear pathway and with clear support for teachers. And we consider that these needs are based on the lack of educational resources, lack of capacity building for teachers, lack of awareness, the fragmented approach, and the lack of funding to strengthen green curricula.
Thank you, Ms. Alana. And you have point again at the importance of have a comprehensive strategies, not fragmented ones, with good finance and that consider teachers and their needs, their training, so that they can be the drivers of the agenda, of the green education agenda as well. So the three of you, Ms. Alana, Brett, Ahmad, you have raised very important points. We'd like to hear from our participants today via Slido. What are the needs and gaps that they see and how can they be filled? So let's go to the Slido platform. Remember, the information is on the chat. You can use event code 0305 to share your views and participate in this second gathering of information via Slido word cloud. Before we move on to the second question, and thanks again to our panelists. So let's see how information starts emerging in this cloud. Teacher training and professional development, as well as cooperation, are emerging as the main themes here. Teacher training remains solidly as the most popular input in the word cloud. Yes, teacher training, professional development. Let's give it a second to continue with the word cloud. I think as inputs continue coming, we continue seeing teacher training at the very center of the word cloud and the main concern around funding, professional development, which is directly related, collaboration, and all other aspects of mainstreaming, curricular provisions, pedagogies seem to be around our main issue of teacher training that is coming very, very clearly out of the inputs. So with this, let's move on to question 2 for the panelists. So let's go to Ahmad again. Ahmad, from your experience in collaborating with other teachers, could you give us some ideas on how could these needs and gaps be filled? Over to you.
Yes, Ingrid, thank you. I think the participant answered some of the questions. And if we're going to talk about the main talking point at the beginning is the proper training for educators. It is well needed in order for them to be prepared and climate ready to tackle those subjects in their classrooms. Not only that, it's really important to have like some kind of curriculum reforms when we talk about including climate education topic within the curriculum. I'm going to talk about my own experience in Lebanon and the project that we are implementing in our schools, in which we are taking a cross-curricular approach in which we included climate education topic within all subjects, be it mathematics, sciences, and so on and so forth, and not having it as a standalone subject that needs to be taught in the classroom. This will help teachers as well in implementing those topics and to have this discussion raised with their students. Contextualization is really important as well, and creating contextualized resources for each area that we are talking with. and more importantly, collaboration opportunities with different stakeholders. It's really essential in order to solve some of those gaps and reduce those gaps. And last but not least, I want to talk about giving the learners the space needed to be more engaged in those topics. Some people or some educators might feel that learners might not be ready to tackle those topics per se, but I can talk about with experience that I saw with my students some amazing ideas and topics and the solution that they thought of. And I was shocked that students can come up with such ideas if given the right space and given the right environment to explore and learn through different projects, through different ideas. So creating the safe learning space for them to explore is essential as well.
Thank you, Ahmed. And that indeed requires tools and training to be able to create that conducive learning environment for the students to showcase the full creativity that they bring into the table with the solutions for the challenges, climate challenges that they experience in their communities. So thank you for bringing that up. And with that, I am going to segue to Ms. Alana. So from your point of view, from the point of view of a policymaker, how do you think we could fill these needs and gaps that have been mentioned today and that we have seen in the word cloud? Over to you.
Bien, en el caso de Honduras,
in the case of Honduras, we are currently reviewing our curriculum. The Education Ministry is doing this, and what we are doing is raising awareness on climate change and the impact it has in our country. And this initiative seeks to create a direct link with nature in our country, promoting a better understanding of the interaction between human beings and nature. And so in our schools, we have introduced sustainability, awareness raising, and other issues in our science curricula to promote a more sustainable future. We also have in mind the document on green schools drafted by UNESCO, which is really guiding us, and we have included many of the notions that are in this document on climate change, and also how to mitigate its effects in our country, how to answer in the case of crisis with a good response system, etc. And this is combined with other curricular tools that need to align with the new curriculum we are now creating, which will allow us to carry out a critical analysis of the measures that are needed to protect the environment in our country. On the other hand, we also think that teachers need to be trained continuously, regularly, so that they are able to include climate change issues in their classes. As our colleague has just said, in this way, teachers will be able to explain how climate change requires whole of system approach. Climate change shouldn't be limited to our natural sciences sphere. It should be included in all other themes and subjects in school. We also think that we need to involve not only students and teachers, but also parents through sustainability projects and different measures that protect the environment. And once again, I wish to highlight that we need to include climate change in all the different subjects with an interdisciplinary approach that will allow us to include climate change in all the subjects. And I also believe that we need to create public policies that promote sustainability and sustainability in all our different ministries. Apart from the education ministry in our country, we also have the human resources ministry, and we are working together in this project. We believe that this is a big opportunity to develop our teacher training, to improve our curriculum, but it is also very important because it will allow us to create a public policy to promote greater sustainability.
And very important to highlight in your remarks the need for public policies to facilitate the cross-cutting mainstreaming of climate in the whole curriculum across subjects in an interdisciplinary manner and as part of larger policies of environmental sustainability. Thank you so much for pointing that out. And with that, then we can go to Brett. Brett, from your perspective, from the early childhood community, could you tell us how these gaps can be filled?
Yes, it's a good segue because I'd like to talk about policy. You've heard from people working at the country level, and when in doubt, ask those in the field of your country or region on what is needed. The priority in Malawi might be different from the priority in Honduras. So national and regional ECD networks are doing great work in this space, and you can ask them. Organizations like ARNEC and AFCAN and the Arab Network for ECD, they're all doing really great work in this space. So let me focus my comments on the global side of things and advocacy. Alana mentioned public policy, and a big part of what we need is advocacy. Funding came up several times as well. From the global early childhood perspective, I think we need to start by recognizing that while all children are vulnerable to climate change, right? It is the youngest of the children that are particularly vulnerable. It's due to their physiological and social, emotional, and cognitive characteristics, and they're fully reliant on their caregivers. So we need to recognize that. We also know how important those first 1,000 days are to brain development, and both the short and long-term outcomes for those individuals. So we need to start with acknowledging this fact from governments, from partners negotiating at COP, from parties negotiating at COP, from the media, so we can all understand what is really at stake and how these agendas are interconnected, and that will require advocacy. Because there is this opportunity that we have. We know from decades of research in early childhood development that quality ECD is one of the best investments a country can make. We know it yields improved outcomes in health and education and economic development. We know it builds individual and community resilience, which is critical to both mitigation and adaptation, and it's going to be even more important, right, as we deal with a changing planet. So I almost get this feeling that we're searching for a magic bullet when it comes to figuring out how do we respond to climate change as an ECD sector. But that magic bullet is nurturing care, and we know how to do it. We know how to support it through policy. So in a way, it's really about doing more of the same, better, with more resources, targeting the most vulnerable. Because we've heard the practice and policy needs for addressing climate change are really the same needs within the sector more broadly. Just the additional specificity is needed. So, one action that we can do right now is really to be purposeful in our advocacy about linking the ECD and climate change agendas. And so what does that exactly mean? It means ensuring the needs of young children are represented at COP, and we're actively advocating with the parties as a sector to elevate the specific needs of young children. It means integrating early childhood into climate action plans, right? Such as national adaptation plans and nationally determined contributions. Currently, young children and the policies and services that support them are largely absent from those strategies. We need to fix that. And we need to help advocates understand what those entry points are for engaging in the development of those strategies. For many working in ECD, I don't think it's particularly clear. And so ECDAN is helping to sort of identify those pathways. But we need to make sure that ECD is part of the climate agenda and part of climate financing, because that's the huge gap, right? And this needs to be new funding through existing climate financing mechanisms like the Loss and Damage Fund. Because if we can connect these dots, right, we connect these two agendas and offer early childhood development as a solution that builds resilience, that drives outcomes for children, that strengthens economies, we're going to be better positioned than we would be if we're just one of many groups raising their hands saying, we need help over here. So we need to come with a solutions-oriented perspective and advocate, because the financing is and will continue to be not enough. But we have a clear return on investment case to make, right? And I think this is really critical as these negotiations around financing get more complex and the financing gets tighter. At any rate, that's sort of the broad response. But align agendas and finance ECD through climate change mechanisms, financing mechanisms, because we need to ensure that the EC agenda is part of that climate agenda. Make sure that ECD is a down payment, right, on building resilience. And so, you know, we do obviously need national standards and curriculum and training and adaptive models and better infrastructure and all these things that we've already talked about. But I think advocacy really remains a critical component that we all can do, and we all have a role to play in.
Thank you, Brett. And again, you have brought many important points to the table. And we indeed need to continue advocating together at the global level, at the national levels, to make sure that climate education, particularly for the youngest learners, is well funded, and that climate funds from the climate architecture, finance architecture, are channeled effectively into education to serve the most marginalized students. So with this, I want to thank you, the three of you, Brett, Mslana, Ahmad, for your insightful comments today. This is a very rich discussion, and I wish we had more time. But also there's an opportunity to go and address the questions that have been brought up by our participants. There are many questions in the Q&A. We only have time for addressing a few of those. So let me start with one of the first questions addressed to the three panelists. So it is, how can we incentivize the teachers for climate change education? And in the very first stage, awareness of the management principles and head departments, it's very important. So how can we support not only teachers, but also school leadership? So from your different points of view, from a policymaker, a teacher, and a global advocate, again, how do you think we can incentivize teachers and school administration, school leadership for integrating climate change education in their practice? Let's start with Ms. Alana. Over to you.
Bien, nosotros consideramos que parte de hacer incidencia.
Thank you for this question. We consider that we need to raise awareness with policymakers, but we also need to include the communities on the ground, because we all need to understand what the situation is on the ground at local level. We, as decision makers, we often see how national authorities decide which initiatives are going to be carried out. And in fact, the Green Schools Initiative didn't appear as a top-bottom approach. It was born in schools thanks to teachers and parents in schools that were really involved in the communities. So from the education sector, I think it is very important to take into account what the key stakeholders bring to the table. These are our teachers, our parents. Obviously, they will bring their ideas to the table, and then the decision makers need to fully understand the problem of climate change to take these projects on. There's a large number of teachers who suggest different initiatives, but obviously for them to be widespread, we need public policies to bring them on board.
Sorry, am I up? I'm sorry. Yeah, I think those are great points. I mean, I think we need to elevate voices from the community, right? Teachers, parents, childcare workers, to, as I mentioned earlier, like really help to highlight what is needed. We need to incentivize higher education institutions to provide the necessary training to support teachers and practitioners and the early childhood workforce. We need more research to understand what works best. And we need to invest in research and highlight what is the most valuable, what are the models that are working in different communities, and how do we How do we support teachers to apply those models and replicate those models in other contexts? And so I think all these pieces, and then yes, policy. We need policy to incentivize adoption of those models. So
thank you, Brett. Thank you, Ahmad. Anything you'd like to add?
I think it's pretty much covered, but like I just wanted to highlight that the fact that teachers themselves, they have no problem in going and to take the step and teach about climate education. The only problem that is missing is the proper training that they are lacking, and that's the point. They have the incentives and they have the will to do that, but they don't have the proper knowledge, or they feel they are not ready to teach about that. So just preparing them to be able to tackle this problem is more than enough.
Thank you, Ahmad. So yeah, you all have highlighted the different dimensions of policy and supporting teachers directly, so they feel confident and they feel ready to engage in teaching climate content. So thank you very much for that. And then the second question that came from our panel, from our participants, is addressed to Brett and Alana. And it's how can we integrate climate crisis education into the early childhood education curriculum in different countries? If you have any insights or examples that you could share or general considerations, please do share. Over to you. So let's start with Brett this time.
Sure. I mean, yeah, we are seeing increased displacement because of climate change, and this will only continue and get worse. And so we do need to be purposeful, and we need dedicated strategies that are focused on crisis situations. But just a couple of things. I mean, I think it's the same things we've talked about. It's supporting training. It's supporting capacity development. It's developing curricula that is contextual and both contextual and adaptable. It's supporting grassroots organizations or practitioners, right, that are working in this space, that are working in these emergency settings, ensuring that they have the resources that they need to deliver the support that they provide. So it's a lot of the same things that we've talked about, but adapting them to emergency contexts and getting ready and preparing. Emergency preparedness is a huge part of this conversation. We haven't really touched on it too much. But as I said, there's a dramatic increase in displacement, and as you mentioned, Ingrid, there is a disruption in terms of children accessing education services and support. So these things are going to increase, and so we need emergency preparedness plans.
Thank you, Brett. And for those of you who are not familiar, and very related to Brett's point, if some of my colleagues could put in the chat for all the participants a link to the comprehensive school safety framework, that would be fantastic, because that's a very important resource that can also be adapted for the lower grades and for early childhood education. So with that, over to you, Ms. Alana.
Muchísimas gracias, Ingrid.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. I fully align myself with what Brett has just said. I do think that we need to take success stories from other countries to replicate them. We have now validated the Green Schools document, the UNESCO publication that explains how to prepare for a crisis, how to reduce risks, and also how to create mitigation actions. And we think that we should raise awareness on this document and the different actions it suggests. We in Honduras have tropical storms, normally from August until October. So we are fully aware that we need to promote safe spaces in schools for boys and girls, but also we need to be ready for these emergencies. The COVID-19 pandemic hit us quite hard in our country and taught us a lesson. And I'd also like to say that Even if we have a crisis preparedness framework to fight against climate change, we think that we also need to have community decision makers who are ready to act when these emergencies appear. We think that we need to train and prepare communities to act and to work alongside our schools when these things happen. And that is why we think that these green school documents also need to have a community approach.
What you have pointed out is also all these considerations can also be found out in the new guidelines on the greening schools. And the link has been shared, is the link for the draft in the chat for everyone's access. But that's very important. In many countries in the world, we have predictable climate events. So we can make sure that the policies, that the strategies are in place to prevent disruptions in learning due to climate events. So with this, the last question, we are running out of time now. Our last question goes to Ahmed. So Ahmed, as long as a long-term vision and to avoid future gaps, the future teachers should be equipped with the required knowledge about climate change at the higher education before starting their careers as teachers. What do you think? So basically this question is pointing to pre-service teacher education and how to integrate, or if we should integrate climate education there. So if you could share your thoughts, thank you. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Sure thing. Basically, it has been mentioned throughout the webinar as a whole that the importance of preparing teachers and either through personal development sessions or through higher education as well. It's really important to include the topic of climate change in the higher education to equip those teachers before starting their career. But not only that, it's not enough for them to learn about the generalized of climate education. It should be also contextualized. I really want to focus on contextualization when it comes to this, because it's really hard to convey a message either for the educators or even the learners themselves about something that they are not facing on a day-to-day basis. So contextualizing those, the education themselves, the material that they are going to be learning and teaching the students is really important as a whole.
Thank you, Ahmed. And indeed, there are many resources out there in the web, but that will not replace the need for contextualized materials and direct support to teachers in their context to address this topic. So thank you so much for bringing this up. And thank you, Brett, Alana, Ahmed, for your inputs. Thank you to all the participants. We are on time now. We have had a very rich conversation today. So thank you again. And please be prepared for the interesting conversations and resources that we will share in this series of webinars. I'm very happy that the first session of the series of conversations today has been full of energy and ideas. And I think my colleagues can share the slide so you can see all the sessions that are upcoming. You can see here the dates from 25 June, 30 July, 10 September. You see it in the slide. We have 5 webinars planned, 1 per month, with very interesting topics focused on mostly how to support teachers and strengthening the capacities of systems for climate education. So we will have 5 more webinars. You can see again the details on the slide. Today's discussion will be published as video recordings, which will be made available at the UNFCCC's ACE Hub and on UNESCO's webinar page. The next webinar will be on the 20th of June at 10 a.m. Central East Time, and will reflect the challenges and concrete solutions in secondary education from the diverse perspective of teachers, educations, young people, and policymakers. This series is also delivered as part of the Action for Climate Empowerment Hub, ACE Hub, supported by the German regional government of North Rhine-Westphalia. So the Zoom link, as usual, will be shared with all of you. And the detailed announcement will be shared before the UNFCCC's ACE Hub and UNESCO's event, and it will be announced in the LinkedIn group and the newsletters. So with this, I want to chair our panelists again, and to all of you for your participation today, for the rich questions that you have posed, and I invite you to connect for the upcoming webinars. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.